In the world of organized crime, loyalty is often spoken of like a sacred oath. It is whispered in smoke-filled backrooms, sealed with handshakes, and enforced with violence that rarely leaves witnesses. But sometimes loyalty becomes the very thing that destroys a man. Hollywood tried to capture that world in films like Goodfellas, a universe of wise guys, suits, and quiet conversations over pasta and wine. Yet even the most famous crime films left out certain stories. Stories that were too cold, too real. One of those stories belonged to a man named Dominick Napolitano, known on the streets simply as Sonny Black, a feared enforcer of the Bonanno crime family, and the man who unknowingly welcomed an FBI agent into the heart of the mafia. The film never showed what happened after the deception was revealed, but the truth was far darker. Dominick Napolitano was born in 1930 in New York City, raised in a world where organized crime was not an abstract concept. It was a neighborhood reality. The Bonanno family was deeply rooted in Brooklyn and Queens, and young men growing up in those streets learned quickly which names commanded respect. Napolitano grew up surrounded by that influence. Unlike the loud, flashy gangsters who chased attention, Dominick was different. According to multiple documented accounts, he was quiet, controlled, and observant. He spoke softly, but his reputation carried weight. By the time he reached adulthood, Napolitano had already begun moving within the orbit of the Bonanno crime family. At first, the work was small: collections, protection rackets, street-level enforcement. But men like Dominick Napolitano rarely stayed small for long. He had the qualities mafia leadership valued most: discipline, silence, and absolute loyalty. By the 1960s and early 1970s, the Bonanno crime family was already one of the 5 families of New York, part of the powerful network that dominated organized crime in America. The Commission, an informal governing body of mafia bosses, oversaw operations that stretched across gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, and labor racketeering. But the Bonanno family had a reputation that was slightly different from the others. It was volatile. Internal conflicts, leadership disputes, and federal pressure had created fractures within the organization. In that environment, men like Dominick Napolitano became valuable. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't even among the highest-ranking captains, but he was trusted. And in the mafia, trust could be more dangerous than power. Napolitano operated primarily out of Brooklyn's social clubs, the quiet meeting places where deals were made, debts settled, and information passed along without ever being written down. Investigators later discovered that his crew was involved in multiple rackets, illegal gambling operations, bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, and enforcement. The last category was where Napolitano earned his reputation. According to law enforcement intelligence reports, Sonny Black had a reputation for being ruthless when discipline was required. But he rarely lost control. Violence in the mafia wasn't chaos. It was procedure, and Napolitano understood procedure. By the late 1970s, the Bonanno family was facing increasing pressure from federal authorities. The FBI had begun intensifying its war on organized crime, using new surveillance methods, informants, and long-term undercover operations. Agents were learning that traditional investigations often failed. The mafia's code of silence, omerta, protected its members from testimony. Wiretaps helped, but access to the inner circles remained nearly impossible. So the FBI tried something far more dangerous. They decided to place a man inside the mafia itself, not just near it, inside it. In 1976, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone began one of the most audacious undercover operations in the history of organized crime investigations. Operating under the alias Donnie Brasco, Pistone slowly began building a reputation in New York's criminal underworld. At first, he was simply another low-level hustler, a jewel thief, a small-time operator looking for opportunity. But undercover work at that level required patience that few agents possessed. Pistone spent years slowly constructing the illusion. He stole jewelry, sold stolen goods, built relationships, and most importantly, he earned trust. The mafia did not welcome strangers easily, but eventually, someone noticed him. That someone was Dominick Napolitano. By the late 1970s, Sonny Black had risen within the Bonanno family and commanded his own crew. He controlled a social club in Brooklyn that functioned as both a headquarters and gathering place for his men. It was here that deals were discussed, disputes settled, and new associates evaluated. And it was here that Donnie Brasco would eventually walk through the door. According to FBI records, Napolitano initially saw Brasco as useful. The undercover agent appeared capable. He knew how to move stolen merchandise. He had street credibility. And most importantly, he seemed loyal. That was enough. Napolitano began bringing Brasco deeper into the crew. The relationship between Sonny Black and Donnie Brasco soon became central to the undercover operation. Napolitano treated Brasco almost like a protege. He vouched for him, protected him, and introduced him to other members of the Bonanno family. Within the mafia hierarchy, that kind of sponsorship carried enormous weight. If a man vouched for someone, his own reputation stood behind that decision. Napolitano believed he had found a reliable associate. But investigators later discovered something even more remarkable. Brasco wasn't just gathering information. He was witnessing the inner mechanics of the mafia. The meetings, the conversations, the threats, the crimes. For nearly 6 years, Joseph Pistone lived inside the world of organized crime. And Dominick Napolitano unknowingly helped make it possible. Inside the Bonanno family, Brasco's presence grew stronger. He participated in criminal activities. He attended mafia gatherings. He was present during discussions that law enforcement had never been able to observe before. Some members of the family even began discussing the possibility of formally making Donnie Brasco, initiating him as a full member of the mafia. That was almost unheard of for an outsider. But Napolitano believed in him. And according to multiple accounts, Sonny Black pushed for Brasco's advancement. He saw potential, opportunity, profit. But in the shadows of that growing trust, the FBI was quietly building one of the most devastating cases in the history of organized crime. As the early 1980s approached, federal investigators had gathered an extraordinary amount of intelligence. Recorded conversations, witness accounts, evidence linking numerous Bonanno family members to serious crimes. The operation had gone far beyond its original expectations. But there was a problem. Undercover operations could not last forever. The longer Pistone remained inside the mafia, the greater the risk. At any moment, a small mistake could expose him. An exposure inside the mafia rarely ended with an arrest. It ended with a body. In 1981, the FBI made a decision. The Donnie Brasco operation would end. Joseph Pistone would be pulled out. Arrests and indictments would soon follow. But the Bureau understood something else. Once the truth became known, the consequences inside the Bonanno family would be catastrophic. The mafia did not forgive infiltration, and the man who had brought Donnie Brasco into the family would be held responsible. At first, the news spread slowly. Rumors, whispers, confusion. A federal agent inside the mafia sounded almost impossible. But then the confirmation arrived. Donnie Brasco was FBI, and suddenly, Dominick Napolitano realized something that chilled him to the bone. For 6 years, he had vouched for a man who never existed. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Bonanno crime family, judgment was already being decided. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Bonanno crime family, judgment was already being decided. The mafia did not operate on misunderstandings. It operated on consequences. When the truth about Donnie Brasco reached the upper levels of the Bonanno family in 1981, the reaction was immediate and brutal. According to multiple documented accounts, disbelief came first. Many members refused to accept it. For years, Donnie Brasco had sat beside them in social clubs, restaurants, and private meetings. He had shared drinks, participated in business, and spoken the language of the streets like someone who had lived it his entire life. The idea that he had been an FBI agent all along seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Federal indictments began appearing. Investigators had recordings, surveillance reports, and detailed intelligence that could only have come from inside the family. The realization spread quickly. Someone had been inside their world. And the man responsible for bringing him there was Dominick Napolitano. In mafia culture, sponsorship carried a sacred weight. When a made man vouched for someone, he placed his own life behind that decision. If the associate proved unreliable, the responsibility fell directly on the sponsor. And Sonny Black had not just vouched for Donnie Brasco. He had defended him, promoted him, and pushed for his advancement. Investigators later discovered that Napolitano had even proposed Brasco for formal induction into the mafia, something that required the approval of multiple captains. Had that ceremony taken place, the consequences for the Bonanno family would have been catastrophic. An FBI agent would have become a made member of the mafia. That alone was enough to trigger panic within the organization. The Bonanno family was already unstable. Internal conflicts had been growing for years. Leadership struggles and power disputes had created factions competing for influence. Now the Brasco infiltration threatened to expose everything. According to federal intelligence reports, Bonanno leaders began conducting quiet internal reviews. They examined every meeting Brasco had attended, every conversation he had heard, every criminal operation he might have witnessed. The damage was impossible to calculate, but one thing was certain: someone had to answer for it. During this period, Dominick Napolitano remained active in Brooklyn. Witnesses later recalled that Sonny Black continued visiting his Knickerbocker Avenue social club, conducting business and meeting with members of his crew. Outwardly, he appeared calm, but beneath the surface, pressure was building rapidly. The FBI understood what was happening. Agents monitoring the situation knew that Napolitano had become the primary target for internal retaliation. Joseph Pistone himself later revealed that he feared for Sonny Black's life once the operation ended, not out of sympathy for a gangster, but because he understood how the mafia enforced accountability. In that world, failure was rarely forgiven, especially when the failure involved an undercover federal agent. Inside the Bonanno family, conversations turned darker. According to multiple informants who later cooperated with investigators, the leadership began discussing how to handle the situation. Allowing Napolitano to live would send the wrong message. If a captain could bring an FBI agent into the family without consequences, discipline across the organization would collapse. The mafia relied on fear. Fear maintained order, and examples had to be made. Yet the decision was not simple. Dominick Napolitano was not an outsider. He was a made man, formally inducted into the Bonanno crime family years earlier. In mafia tradition, executing a made member required approval from high-ranking leadership. These killings were not impulsive. They were sanctioned, organized, quietly arranged. Investigators later discovered that discussions about Napolitano's fate reached the upper ranks of the family, and eventually, approval was given. Sonny Black would have to die. What makes the story even more unsettling is how the order was delivered. According to law enforcement reports compiled after the fact, Napolitano was not hunted down or ambushed. Instead, the message arrived through the same channels that had once signaled respect. He was summoned to a meeting. Within mafia culture, such a meeting carried heavy meaning. When a man was called to sit down with senior members of the family, refusal was not an option. Attendance was mandatory, and often final. In August of 1981, Dominick Napolitano received word that he was expected to attend a gathering with Bonanno leadership. The location was never publicly confirmed with certainty, but investigators believe it was arranged somewhere in Brooklyn. When Sonny Black prepared to leave for the meeting, witnesses noticed something unusual. He removed personal items from his pockets. According to one widely documented account, Napolitano handed his jewelry to a trusted associate. Then he said something that would later be repeated in multiple investigations. He reportedly told them, "If I don't come back, take care of my family." Those words carried quiet understanding. Napolitano knew exactly what the meeting meant. In the mafia, summons like that rarely ended in negotiation. They ended in judgment. On the day he left for the meeting, Sonny Black dressed carefully. Dark clothing, clean shoes, nothing unusual. But according to investigators who later reconstructed the event, he never returned. There were no witnesses, no public confrontation, no dramatic shootout. That was not how the mafia handled internal executions. Instead, Napolitano simply disappeared. For days, rumors circulated throughout Brooklyn's organized crime circles. Some claimed he had fled. Others insisted he was being held somewhere while the family determined his fate. But investigators already suspected the truth. The mafia had delivered its verdict, and Dominick Napolitano had paid the price. Months later, information began surfacing through confidential sources. The details were chilling. According to multiple accounts gathered during later investigations, Sonny Black had been executed shortly after arriving at the meeting. The method was consistent with mafia discipline. A gunshot. Quick. Controlled. No public spectacle. But the punishment did not end there. Investigators later discovered that his body had been treated in a way meant to send a clear message to anyone who might repeat his mistake. Napolitano's hands had been severed. In mafia symbolism, the meaning was unmistakable. The hands represented the man who had shaken hands with an FBI agent, the man who had vouched for him, the man who had allowed a federal infiltrator to walk into the inner circles of the Bonanno family. And for that betrayal, intentional or not, his hands were removed. For law enforcement, the murder confirmed what they had always known about organized crime. The mafia did not tolerate failure, and it never forgot humiliation. The Donnie Brasco operation had exposed the Bonanno family to unprecedented scrutiny. It had embarrassed leadership. An embarrassment inside the mafia often triggered violence. But the consequences were only beginning, because the infiltration had done more than expose one family. It had revealed the internal workings of the entire American mafia. And soon, federal prosecutors would begin using that information in ways the mafia had never faced before. As the investigation expanded, dozens of organized crime figures were indicted. Surveillance operations intensified. The FBI began building cases that would reshape the government's war against the mafia. But inside the Bonanno family, fear was spreading. Members began asking themselves a question that had once seemed impossible. If an FBI agent could live among them for 6 years, who else might be watching? The Donnie Brasco infiltration had shattered the illusion of security that organized crime had relied on for decades. And Dominick Napolitano's death was only the beginning of the fallout. Because investigators were about to reveal something even more devastating. The operation that destroyed Sonny Black was also about to change the entire future of the American mafia. The operation that destroyed Sonny Black was also about to change the entire future of the American mafia. By the early 1980s, federal investigators had already gathered years of intelligence from the Donnie Brasco infiltration. But the full scale of what Joseph Pistone had accomplished would only become clear after Dominick Napolitano disappeared. Inside FBI offices, agents began assembling evidence collected during the 6-year operation. Recorded conversations, detailed surveillance reports, descriptions of criminal operations that had never before been documented so clearly. For decades, the mafia had survived because its inner workings were hidden behind layers of secrecy and loyalty. Informants existed, but they were usually low-level associates, men with limited knowledge of how the organization truly functioned. Donnie Brasco had been different. He had been inside the rooms where decisions were made, and the information he carried out with him would trigger one of the most devastating waves of prosecutions organized crime had ever faced. Investigators later discovered that Pistone's undercover work had exposed dozens of mafia figures across multiple families. The Bonanno family, however, suffered the most immediate damage. Within months of the operation ending, federal authorities began issuing indictments tied directly to evidence gathered during the infiltration. Charges ranged from racketeering and conspiracy to illegal gambling, extortion, and murder-related investigations. According to Justice Department records, more than 100 mafia members and associates would eventually be indicted as a result of the Donnie Brasco operation. The Bonanno family's leadership structure was shaken. Several captains and soldiers faced prosecution. Others went underground, fearing that additional evidence might surface. But the legal consequences were only part of the destruction. The psychological damage within the mafia ran even deeper. For generations, organized crime families had relied on a single principle to protect themselves. Omerta, the code of silence. Members were taught from the moment they entered the life that secrecy was sacred. Outsiders were never trusted. Conversations were guarded. Suspicion was constant. Yet Joseph Pistone had lived among them for 6 years. He had attended meetings, shared meals, taken part in criminal activity, and none of them had known. For many mafia members, that realization was terrifying. If Donnie Brasco could exist, then the walls of secrecy they depended on might not exist at all. Inside the Bonanno family, Dominick Napolitano's execution became a grim lesson. According to multiple documented accounts, the message was meant to be unmistakable. No one was above accountability. Even a respected captain could be eliminated if his actions endangered the organization. Napolitano's disappearance sent shockwaves through Brooklyn's underworld. Many members of his crew vanished from public view for weeks. Some feared that further purges might follow. Others quietly distanced themselves from the leadership, unsure who might be blamed next. The atmosphere within the family became tense and uncertain, and federal authorities were watching closely. The story of Sonny Black did not end with his death. In fact, investigators later discovered that his fate continued to influence the mafia long after he was gone. Joseph Pistone himself would later speak about Dominick Napolitano with a complicated mixture of respect and inevitability. According to Pistone's own accounts, Sonny Black had treated him with loyalty during the years they worked together. He had defended him, trusted him, and protected him from suspicion. But the undercover agent always knew how the story would end. The moment the operation concluded, Napolitano's life would be in danger. Because in the mafia's world, mistakes like that were unforgivable. The film Goodfellas briefly touched on the Donnie Brasco operation, referencing the infiltration that had shaken organized crime. But the film never showed what truly happened afterward. It never showed the quiet meeting, the walk into a room where judgment was already decided, the gunshot that ended Dominick Napolitano's life. Hollywood often focuses on the rise of gangsters, the power, the money, the reputation, but the endings are usually quieter and far darker. In the years following the Brasco operation, the American mafia entered a new era of vulnerability. Federal prosecutors began using powerful legal tools such as RICO statutes to dismantle entire criminal organizations rather than targeting individual crimes. Investigators had learned that the mafia functioned like a corporate structure. If the leadership could be linked to criminal conspiracies, entire hierarchies could be prosecuted at once. The Donnie Brasco infiltration provided investigators with valuable insight into exactly how those hierarchies operated. The structure of crews, the role of captains, the methods used to approve crimes and distribute profits. Information that had once been hidden behind the mafia's code of silence was now documented in federal case files, and prosecutors were ready to use it. Meanwhile, the Bonanno family struggled to recover from the damage. Leadership conflicts intensified. Some members questioned whether the execution of Sonny Black had truly solved the problem, or simply exposed deeper weaknesses within the organization. Because the real humiliation had not been Napolitano's mistake. The humiliation had been the infiltration itself. For 6 years, the FBI had walked through their doors, listened to their conversations, and learned their secrets. Dominick Napolitano had been punished for that failure. But the damage could never be undone. Years later, law enforcement officials would describe the Donnie Brasco operation as one of the most successful undercover infiltrations in the history of organized crime investigations. Joseph Pistone's work changed how federal agencies approached the mafia. It proved that deep infiltration was possible, and that even the most secretive criminal organizations could be penetrated. But the operation also left a trail of destruction behind it. Arrests, indictments, internal executions, lives erased in the quiet enforcement of mafia discipline. Dominick Napolitano became one of those erased figures. His body was never officially recovered. According to multiple accounts from informants and investigators, the remains were likely disposed of in a way designed to prevent discovery. That was another common mafia practice. A missing body meant fewer legal complications, fewer questions, and fewer witnesses. In official records, Dominick Napolitano simply disappeared in August 1981, but everyone inside the underworld understood what had happened. In Brooklyn, the Knickerbocker Avenue Social Club, where Sonny Black once held court, eventually closed. The chairs were removed, the tables cleared away. Another gathering place in the long history of organized crime quietly vanished. New crews formed, new leaders emerged, but the shadow of the Donnie Brasco operation remained, because it had proven something the mafia once believed impossible. That loyalty could be fabricated, trust could be manufactured, and the man sitting beside you might not be who he claimed to be. Dominick Napolitano spent his life believing in the rules of that world. Loyalty to the family, obedience to its leadership, and the certainty that those rules protected the men who followed them. But in the end, those same rules sealed his fate. He had welcomed a stranger into the mafia, a stranger who carried a hidden identity. And when the truth finally surfaced, The organization he had served for decades delivered its final judgment. Quietly, efficiently, without hesitation. The film never showed that ending. But according to investigators, the reality was far simpler. Dominick Napolitano walked into a room in 1981, and he never walked out again.